everyone, I'm Sharon. I am a COPHP student at the University of Washington, and I'm so excited because today we have Jennifer Hennessy here with us. She is a policy advisor with Governor Inslee's Shellfish Initiative, and she is here to provide an overview of the shellfish and oyster industry, including information on the history, production, and supply chain. So let's get started. Hi Jennifer, thank you so much for being here today. So I wanted to start with the basics. What is it about the Washington coast that makes it ripe for producing delicious oysters? Well, thanks so much for having me here. So Washington's oyster industry has a long and rich history that's intricately linked to many prominent historical moments. If you want the full story, we have to go back thousands of years to when glaciers covered much of what we are referring to today as the Pacific Northwest. As the earth began warming, the glaciers melted, creating an expansive waterscape that today includes the Puget Sound and Hood Canal. Climate change, other geological events, and tides formed the beautiful bays, inlets, coves, and estuaries that the Pacific Northwest is known for, and the perfect habitat for oysters to thrive. See, oysters need time underwater when the tide is in to pull nutrients from the salty water and give them that salty brine that we love, but they also require sun exposure at low tide to strengthen their shells and protect them from predators. The tidal inundation in this area is perfect. Okay, so we have historical and geological events to thank for allowing oysters to flourish here, right? But how did the oyster industry first develop and evolve into what it is today? So native Western Washington tribes have been harvesting shellfish, including oysters and clams, as subsistence and ceremonial food for thousands of years. Like many of our famous crops and trades, the oyster industry unfortunately has its roots in racism and exploitation of indigenous peoples. Geological findings show that the Olympic oyster was prolific in the Willapa Bay and southern Puget Sound as an emblem of sustenance, customs, and trade for native populations for many generations. But by the late 1700s, European settlers had begun to appropriate the oyster beds for their own consumption and local trade. And in 1851, they began shipping Washington oysters to California, where gold rush miners were willing to pay $30 for oysters that cost $1 at the source. And in the late 1800s, legislation passed to allow residents to own tidal lands for the sole purpose of growing and harvesting oysters. Washington was the first state to do that, and still to this day is the only state that has that legislation, which shows just how important oysters and shellfish have been to the Washington economy for over a century. And with the development of infrastructure and new equipment, what started as a small oyster collection business quickly evolved into a large oyster industry that was exporting oysters all over the country. You mentioned the Olympia oysters in Willapa Bay in the Puget Sound. Are those the main shellfish that we produce today? Not at all. By early 1920s, Washington's stock of Olympia oysters began to decline rapidly, so oyster companies began importing oysters from the East Coast and Japan. East Coast oysters failed to reproduce naturally in the Washington waters, but the Japanese oyster seeds, which would turn into the Pacific oysters we know today, thrived here. The creation of shellfish seed hatcheries in the 1970s greatly increased the availability of shellfish throughout the state. And today, most of the oysters cultivated here are non-native, the Pacific oyster being the most common. In fact, Pacific oysters are the leading shellfish species found in Washington, followed by the manila clam, mussels, then geoduck clams, and softshell crabs. Almost 9 million pounds of Pacific oysters are produced in Washington each year, primarily in the South Puget Sound area, followed by Willapa Bay and the Hood Canal. 9 million pounds of Pacific oysters? How do Washingtonians consume that much each year? Haha, not just Washingtonians. There is a growing demand for seafood, so the roughly 24 million shellfish produced in Washington are commercially sold throughout the United States and exported worldwide, with primary markets in Canada and Hong Kong. Currently, Washington is the leading U.S. producer with annual sales over 150 million. We have over 300 farms along our Washington coast, which account for more than 25% of the total domestic production by weight in our state. In fact, 1/4 of the nation's oysters come from Willapa Bay in Grays Harbor.
Wow, those are impressive numbers. 300 farms? I live right by Willapa Bay. Does this mean I can go visit the farm and do some harvesting?
Well, not exactly. The Washington Department of Health licenses and regulates over 300 companies that commercially harvest and sell shellfish, with the goal of making sure those shellfish are safe for public consumption. This allows the Department of Health to monitor water to ensure it is safe and does not pose a threat to public health. It also allows them to close commercial areas if there is a threat and ensures companies comply with sanitation requirements. The Department of Health also oversees the recreational shellfish program to inform the public where and how they can harvest shellfish that are safe. And you can find the commercial shellfish map and the recreational beach safety map on the Department of Health website.
So it's clear Washington shellfish aquaculture plays an important role within Washington and in domestic seafood production, right?
Certainly. The shellfish industry is a foundation of Washington's economy and an important part of our state's heritage. I'd say it's a source of pride for our state as well. There are over 3,200 direct and indirect shellfish aquaculture jobs in the state, contributing to $77 million in commercial industry wages each year.
That's great, but it seems like hard work. Are there any occupational health issues related to aquaculture jobs?
I'm so glad you asked that. Workers in aquaculture may be exposed to a variety of hazards on the job. They use waterborne vessels and all-terrain tractors and vehicles that have their own unique hazards. In addition to that, extreme temperatures, bacterial pathogens, heavy lifting, long hours, chemical exposures, all of these things contribute to the risk of injury or illness in these workers. In fact, there have been some studies that found aquaculture workers in Washington are experiencing higher occupational injury rates compared to workers in other states. And given the growth and importance of the industry in our state, I feel that the industry should devote greater attention to prevention of work-related injuries, and enhanced occupational safety and health programs for this industry could help reduce injuries as well.
And what about for indigenous groups? Do they have the same access to aquaculture jobs in Washington?
Interestingly, local tribes in the state of Washington are co-managers of the state's shellfish resources, providing equal share of the yearly shellfish harvest to both the state and local tribes. But given the extreme importance of shellfish to Washington tribes and the exploitation of them and their lands by early settlers, I often wonder if there is more we could do to make reparations to the indigenous populations.
So it sounds like there are a lot of key players in this industry. Who oversees all of this? Like, how do we keep water healthy, workers healthy, and achieve production numbers and continue to create jobs?
Well, that is something my colleague Brittany can tell you more about, but I did want to mention the Washington Shellfish Initiative that I'm a part of. It is a partnership between state government, federal government, tribes, the shellfish aquaculture industry, and non-government entities. And it was formed in 2011 following the National Shellfish Initiative by NOAA. They've already made huge strides in reducing sewage pollution in the water, addressing ocean acidification, and restoring native oysters like the Olympia oyster. More recently, they've renewed their commitment to coastal communities in all aspects of commercial, recreation, and tribal shellfish harvesting, and they're working to ensure our waters are clean, increase sustainable aquaculture practices, restore native shellfish, advance research, and educate the next generation about shellfish so that we might have a more sustainable future.
Those are great priorities, and I appreciate the commitment to ensuring safety and public health throughout the shellfish and oyster industry. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today, Jennifer.